Well, as an educator, we're both frustrated that we probably have not done a good enough job in K through 12 and higher education teaching science as a process, as opposed to a collection of facts that appear in your textbook, which are going to be outdated by the time you graduate.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. One of the most frustrating aspects of the last 18 months as we have lived through this global pandemic known as COVID-19 has been the rampant misunderstanding of the scientific process and an inability to accurately portray what the scientific process means. We've heard over and over again since March 2020 to trust the science. But what does that mean? Because for many people who are skeptical or perhaps dipping their toes in the conspiracy theory pond, trust the science sounds a little bit too brainwashy. And I think that's where a lot of the problem starts. We think of science, or when we hear trust the science, and we think of memorizing periodic tables or memorizing facts about covalent bonds in chemistry or these irrefutable laws of science. All things that we learn about growing up in school, but all things that are presented, usually in a textbook, in such a way that it presents science, with a big S, as fact, when in reality, science is filled with uncertainty. Science is filled with a lack of understanding, but that's where the crucial difference comes into play. It's that lack of understanding that fuels the scientific process to create a hypothesis, to test that hypothesis in such a way that biases and assumptions are removed. And no matter the outcome, the results, if they can be replicated, are then not set in stone, but actually held up as this is what we know. Can we disprove it? Or can we further prove that it is correct? But this blanket rallying cry of trust the science lacks so much nuance. And that is what my guests today, and yes, that is plural, that is what we talk about here in this week's episode. My guests this week are Gale, Sinatra, and Barbara Hofer, who have written a book called Science Denial: Why It Happens and What to Do About It. Gale is a professor of education and psychology at the University of Southern California, and Barbara is a professor of psychology emerita at Middlebury College in Vermont. The nuance missing from Trust the Science is that, as Gale and Barbara write in their book, science is not a panacea for all problems, but what science actually is the process that involves systematically questioning what one knows. It's why at the beginning of a global pandemic, perhaps you're told not to wear a mask, but then one day the recommendations change. It's why you're first told clean and wash your groceries when you get home from the grocery store, but then one day you're told that's not necessary. At least for me, this has been the area of perhaps the greatest frustration as we have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic over the last 18 months, is that basic understanding that science is all about uncertainty and working to disprove itself, and the difference between widely accepted research and replicated research and a singular study that may or may not point to some sort of scientific evidence of causality. And perhaps what's most interesting about all of it is that we have, as Gale and Barbara write in their book, this cafeteria denial of science. The vast majority of us don't deny science outright, but we cherry pick. We pick and choose based on worldviews and biases and assumptions. And again, this is a misunderstanding of the scientific process. Over the last year, I think probably more than anything, I have heard the phrase, trust the science.
Yeah.
But in reading your work and your book, I feel that's too oversimplified. And am I correct in saying that?
Yes, I would say that's oversimplified. Gale and I often point to the scientific studies where there's only one study out and it hasn't yet been corroborated or something like that. We want people to be discerning about trusting the science, to think about, is there sufficient evidence? Has it been corroborated? Is there enough there for us to go on to be able to trust it? On the other hand, there are lots of good reasons for trusting science overall. I think it makes sense that we want to think about evidentiary science and how it can guide the kinds of decisions we make as individuals and the kind of policy decisions that we would like our leaders to make.
Right. And I would follow up and say that, as Barbara mentioned, there's certain science that's more what we would call consensus science, which is not the single study with too few participants, but something like the IPCC report that just came out very recently, which is based on hundreds of scientists' work and thousands of studies across multiple countries and different disciplines. And that presented a very stark picture about humans' contributions to climate change. That kind of consensus view, we definitely would say that's something you should put more trust in than an individual study that says chocolate cures cancer or helps you lose weight that your friend shared with you on Facebook. That's the kind of thing you want to be more skeptical of.
And that was what was coming to my mind is we've all seen it, right? We all saw over the last 18 months, somebody raise their hand and I'm waving my hand up in the air, but they're usually doing it on social media, citing one story, one source, saying, look, this is all the proof that you need to see that COVID's not as bad as possible, or this thing, this new drug will help fight it better than the vaccine. And it's that looking at one single source as a topic of, or as a proof, really, that is the bigger issue. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, I think that's what we would argue, that you really want to think about evidence-based, substantive number of studies to be able to trust the science. But we have that. We have that in many ways. As Gale said, there were 234 scientists who weighed on the IPCC report from 1,400 studies. We very much need to trust that. If you're not trusting that, you're in the category of science denier. That is seriously problematic. Similarly, we know a lot about how COVID is transmitted, and we didn't in the beginning. And I think that led to a lot of frustration on the part of people who don't really understand how science works and what it meant to have a novel coronavirus. Novel means we hadn't seen it before. Scientists didn't know much about it. They didn't know if it was transmitted through fomites. Did we need to be washing our hands fanatically and washing our groceries when they came in? Did we need to be wearing masks? Was it respiratory? But we know a lot now. And that's what it means to trust the science. We've got so many people working around the clock trying to bring us good information on these topics, and we need to listen to them.
Gale, where was the failure or the breakdown to understand that it's the scientific process to actually change? That to me was one of the most frustrating things, just kind of sitting back and watching human behavior through all this is, my goodness, people don't understand that science actually is seeking to disprove itself all the time, right?
Yes.
Well, as an educator, we're both frustrated that we probably have not done a good enough job in K through 12 and higher education teaching science as a process, as opposed to a collection of facts that appear in your textbook, which are going to be outdated by the time you graduate. So definitely we haven't done that. We are certainly moving towards that, the next generation science standards, recommended standards for us to teach in K-12 education, the process and practices by which scientists know something, how do they know? So that's the direction that we should be going. But there's no doubt that we haven't done enough of that. And so the fact that science changes and changed during COVID is the strength of science, not the weakness, because it's responding to new evidence. And that's why you should trust science, because unlike a belief system where you stick to your beliefs absolutely not based on evidence, it is evidentiary. So as the evidence changes, that's the strength of science to say, oh, we thought, you had to wash your groceries, but that turns out to be wrong. You do not, and here is why.
For both of you.
There was a lovely piece in the New York Times this week about the American public getting a crash course in scientific uncertainty, and that this has been very difficult for people who want certainty, and some people do. They want to know that everybody knows it for sure, and they're not aware of how this process is evolving and how scientists continue to learn and continue to chip away at what we know.
How did the two of you come together to talk about this? What was the catalyst moment to actually write this book and say, hey, we're frustrated here? Barbara.
Gale and I have both worked on this topic for 25 years. We've been interested in the public understanding of science. And the two of us had done very parallel paths, and we'd meet at conferences and talk about these issues. And then in 2011, we were both invited to a small working conference near the United Nations brought together by the National Science Foundation and the German equivalent Science Foundation. And it was on the public understanding of science, and brought people together across disciplines and across fields to really share what we knew at that point in time. And out of that, we ended up writing peer review articles about this topic. But peer-reviewed articles are wonderful, but they only go to your peers. They go to other psychologists. And so we were writing in the journals that other psychologists read. And then we thought it's really important for us to get this message out to the public. And we want to share the knowledge that psychologists have about denial, doubt, resistance, that kind of thing, and what psychologists know about that. And we also are both very passionate about the environment and about the kinds of things that concern us, that policy's not acting fast enough because there aren't enough people who actually understand the science.
I was struck by, and I just lost my train of thought. You talked about uncertainty, the uncertainty of science. I'm all over my, let me recenter myself here.
Aren't these some moments when you're glad it's not live?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I know. I can edit all this out.
No.
I can edit all this out. What was I going to say there?
There was trust, and then uncertainty, and then
scientific literacy, and
it had to do with the uncertainty of science. Oh, yes. Okay. You mentioned the uncertainty of science a little bit ago. Why do we hold science up to this standard of when something comes out, that it is certain and truthful and obviously truthful, but that it is the end all be all answer and that it stops there? We all remember, back in grade school, you come up with a hypothesis and then you test things and then you come up with a theory. Like, where is the breakdown in that?
Well, I think it's been too simplistically portrayed in textbooks in education that there is a scientific method and that it proceeds in a lockstep way, that we can easily get answers if we do it the right way. And of course, science doesn't proceed like that. Famously, many scientific discoveries are happenstance, or someone is doing a different experiment and something falls into the test tube and, oh, look. So there's a normal process of science that isn't as rigid and lockstep. There's other ways to do science besides controlled experiments, such as observations, that You can see evidence accumulating that way. So I think it's because we've taught science as a collection of facts where if you do the experiment the right way, you get the right answer, because that's how lab books are in high school chemistry. But that's not the real world of how science works. It's much more dynamic. It's much more fluid. It's much more responsive to situations on the ground as they're occurring, which we saw happening quite rapidly during the COVID crisis.
Barbara, you mentioned you wanted to get this information out to the public and address the denial of science and the scientific process. One of the things I found fascinating in the book, and I've thought myself many times before, is the general public doesn't have access to the literature. To actually, a lot of it is behind paywalls that people just simply aren't going to pay for. So how do we bridge that gap?
It's a serious problem. But there are two issues there. One is it's behind a paywall. The other is that it's often very difficult to understand because scientists, psychologists, social scientists are writing for each other. And they're using technical language. Often people don't have the background for that. So a lot of what we talk about in the book is good science communication, is why we need people to interpret scientific findings to the public in ways that are responsible. And sometimes we see journalists not doing that effectively. And I know you're a journalist, and so I'd be curious in your thoughts about this. But one of the things that we have looked at is the issue of needing to present both sides of something, for example. So we find that in the issue of climate change, for many years, if a reporter was talking about climate change, they thought they had to also interview a denier. And finally, the BBC first, and now other publications have weighed in, said, we don't want that anymore. That's ridiculous. That's as though the Manchester United's win is still disputable, and that we need to interview somebody who thinks they didn't win. That just doesn't make sense. And they said, this is settled science. We know this for sure now, and we are no longer going to interview science deniers every time we talk about climate change. And that kind of thinking is really problematic. I mean, that affects the public. And there's a wonderful study called Balance as Bias, and how balance becomes bias. That what happens when people hear stories like that, and they've done controlled studies that show this, is they're more likely to think the science is unsettled than it actually is. So what we need are good communicators, good science communication. And Gale and I have been dismayed to see how few newspapers even have a science section anymore compared to 10 and 15 years ago, that science is not being covered as effectively. And I mentioned that we attended this conference with a German scientist and psychologist 10 years ago, and they were really intrigued by the fact that scientists are often not evident in our news stories, where in Germany, they said often you're going to see a scientist interviewed. You see scientists on the news all the time talking about what they've discovered, what they know. And I can't remember the last time I saw that pre-COVID, when we would have seen actual scientists being interviewed about a topic. It's just not as common here, they pointed out, as it is in Europe.
Well, in addition to the fact that the research articles are behind a paywall and too difficult for even other scientists perhaps to understand if they don't have the academic background in that specific discipline, you hear people say, just do your own research. But of course, you can't really do your own research, right? I'm not going to measure ocean temperature or ocean acidification or ice cores. I'm not going to be able to do that. Do your own research for the general public usually means Google it. And that's obviously hugely problematic. And we talk extensively in the book about why algorithms kind of drive you to the most clicked on or most popular sources, not necessarily the more reliable. Sometimes those are mis and disinformation. So do your own research is really not practicable on many levels.
And it's often disturbing how little students actually know about how these algorithms work, or even that they exist. We've been surprised how many students think, well, if it's in the top 10 hits that get returned to me when I search for something, it must be reliable, accurate, verified. And they have no idea that those are not any of the criteria that determine what comes up first in a Google search. So Sam Weinberg at Stanford has done a lot of research on what middle school and high school students and college students actually know about searching for things, and was just dismayed that it was so much worse than he even thought. And so he's advocated lateral searching, that you find an article, now you go find it somewhere else, you go find corroborating evidence, you learn how to search across websites for things that look like they're verifiable, but you don't just go vertically down the down the page to see what comes up. That's not the best way to do it.
And we talk about the need for not just the kind of digital literacy that Barbara's talking about in terms of sourcing information, but even algorithmic literacy, which is knowing that how these algorithms work and how they can drive mis and disinformation, and being aware of that helps you step back and think whether, this first source that popped up that says dinosaurs did exist at the same time as humans maybe needs to be looked at a little more carefully.
It strikes me that it's even required of the person to think about how they search for the topic and how they question the question in their mind, if that makes sense, right? Like you can add assumption to what you're searching for too, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. And we talk in the book a lot about cognitive biases, and one of them is confirmation bias. That there's this implicit process that we tend to seek and confirm and remember the things that already fit the pre-existing beliefs that we had. And so if you go online looking for something and you already have an idea about what you think the answer is, it's really easy to stop as soon as you find that answer. Think, okay, see, there it is. And that's ludicrous in many ways when you think about all the reasons why you might have found that answer first. It might be, as you said, because of the way you framed the question. But it takes a lot of thinking to slow it down and to try to figure out what really is truthful in these things that you're searching, and not to just stop when you've confirmed what you already believed. And we talk in the book also about Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2 thinking. So he talks about System 1 thinking as the very quick, intuitive response. And that's often what we do when we're online. And he talks about System 2 thinking as being rational, analytical, thoughtful, that it's slower, that we need. The book is called Thinking Fast and Slow, from Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for this work. It's really important for us to slow down when we're doing those things. And we can't slow down all the time. We're not advocating that. But you need to know when you need to slow down and how you can go about that. And one of the things Gale and I've discussed also is it's not just an individual process. We need social media to step up and help with that. And the example that we often give is that Twitter now has, and you've probably seen it, a feature where if you go to retweet something and you've not actually opened it, you've just looked at the headline, you get a little note back that says, would you like to read this before you share it? And several people, when we brought this up, have mentioned, oh yeah, that made me slow down. I stopped and thought, do I actually know what's in that story? Maybe I better think about it first. Maybe I better actually read it.
We also talk about the motivations people have for searching for information. So if you go online because your friend told you that the vaccines can cause infertility, which they cannot, but if you go online with that information in your head that you've been told that, and you seek confirming evidence because you're motivated to believe that article that says that, if they pop up in one of the first searches you do, you will use that information, and you may evaluate it less critically, and you may evaluate information disconfirming that idea more critically. And that's part of the motivated reasoning that you can do around topics you've searched for online that contributes to these already biased ways of thinking. And it requires that System 2 reflection to say stop and think about what you've just read.
One of my favorite memes from the last 12 months or so was one of a man sitting at a computer shouting to his wife in the other room, "Honey, come look, I found something that all the world's top scientists and epidemiologists miss while searching on the internet." And it just made me laugh, and it made me kind of sad at the same time. On that fact, Gale, on what you just talked about in our motivations, why do we find the personal one-to-one experiences so much more convincing than a body of research and work? I believe you said, and I want to read this because I thought this was great. We are at the mercy of the compelling story and the testimony of others, or likely to think our own experience is broadly generalizable. That's a big word. Yeah. Why? Why in the world do we take just our one-to-one experiences over as more proof over actual proof?
Well, we certainly have evolved to value the narrative, and the narrative told to us by trusted others. That's how information was passed along for a long, long time, long before the internet, long before books, long before written word. It was the story, and the story told by someone you trust. So we're seeing this awful situation right now with people taking drugs made for deworming livestock instead of taking the vaccination in the hopes this is going to help them with COVID. For some people, that sounds to us like, what? How could that possibly happen? Why would anyone do that? Well, that's a matter of trust. If everyone in your environment does not trust the vaccine because they've been told not to trust it, and everyone that you respect and that you follow and that you listen to and that you read says this is other drug, but they're not letting you have it, and it's this drug that's going to make you cured, that's how you can go down that unfortunate path. So it's about trust and who you trust, which is people in your community. And you could turn that around, though. And we have seen that. For example, pastors who are offering vaccinations on Sunday after church. There's a trusted community member who's bringing in the local doctor to answer questions you might have, and then you can get your vaccine. So you can turn that mistrust into trust when you use appropriate people to communicate and answer real questions people may have.
On the topic of trusted others, and I like that phrasing there, you make the point in the book as well that science is not infallible, that science is actually performed by scientists who are in fact humans and therefore subject to bribery and jealousy and their own delusions, perhaps somewhere down the road. What can we do to separate out bad actors from a perhaps more global consensus on an issue?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to know is that science is self-correcting, that those things happen, but they're rarely sustained. I mean, I think the example that we can give is that most people know is Wakefield, the doctor who came out with a study that autism was linked to vaccinations. It was overturned. It was repealed. He lost his license. The danger in this particular era, however, is that he lives on in the minds of people who are very anti-vax. And now I mean anti-vax pre-COVID. They were anti-vaccinating their children in this case because they were worried about autism. And they just clung to that, even though it has been resoundingly discredited. And so we do need to look at whether things like that are sustained or turned around, or it is a self-correcting discipline. And back to the why trust science question, a lot of it is for this reason, is that the discipline does self-correct. It's a community of people who work to move towards the truth.
And the expression we talked about earlier, trust the science, it's not trust the scientist. There's not one person who you should trust. There's not one scientist who you should trust, because every individual, all of us are flawed human beings, and because of all the reasons you said, that is definitely something that we should be aware of. But it's the accumulated evidence, as we've discussed earlier, that you want to trust when it warrants trust, when there's enough of that evidence to warrant the trust.
So I want to run some stuff by you all and see what you think about this. I am also a certified personal trainer. I don't know that I've ever shared that on this particular show. But in the context of COVID and the novel coronavirus, obviously we have vaccines out there. We've seen the efficacy data, even when it comes to preventing severe illness with the Delta variant. We've seen that. But we've also seen, and I'm going to say I dug into the research. I didn't do the research. Thank you, Barbara, for that turn of phrase. That's important. I dug into the research, and we're seeing that obesity is one of the leading causes, or one of the leading comorbidities of severe illness, I should say, not causes. But we rarely see the communication of healthy eating and exercising and losing body fat as a way to perhaps prime your body against severe illness. And I know from the fitness community, and sorry for the long-winded kind of explanation here, but I know from the fitness community that has sowed some doubt into just the motivations behind the communication that's coming out. How would you address that mindset in the fitness world?
Can you clarify, when you say it's sowed doubt, are you saying that not making the connection is what sowed doubt?
Good point. Let me clarify. It sowed doubt that the vaccinations were driven for money reasons, monetary reasons.
Oh.
You can't make money off of, there's no pill to reduce body fat. You have to do hard work, so there's nothing that pharmacologically you can do. I think it sowed doubt in the fitness space that this was all, the vaccines were simply for monetary purposes.
Ooh.
Well, I'd like to speak to the issue of the diseasification of obesity. So, obesity itself isn't a disease, although that's how it's become termed. And the reason why I'm saying that's really controversial, whether it is or isn't, is because it's really, as you said, it's not the causal factor. It's just related to other causal factors. So that's been a problem with how we treat and mistreat people who are suffering from obesity. So I think there's been a lot of insensitivity to people who are overweight. There's been a lot of course, fat shaming and terrible behavior towards people who have challenges with their weight. That said, there is some evidence that people who are overweight do less well if they get COVID. There's a lot of good reasons for that are related to weight, but it's, as you said, a lot of other comorbid conditions such as diabetes or heart disease that really is the factor, not the obesity directly itself. So that's a complicated issue, and yes. I hope we don't go about something that I heard my neighbor say the other day. Well, I'm not too worried about COVID because I'm really thin. It's really just the obese who are suffering. And that's absolutely not true. It is true they've had less good outcomes, even more mortality, but it is not true that fit people like yourself and your trainees are not also susceptible to some severe outcomes from COVID.
Yeah, I was just going to say similar things. I live in Vermont and we have an 86% vaccination rate and still have cases climbing. And that still means that 14% are not vaccinated. It's the highest vaccination in the country. And what I listen to the governor's press conference regularly with the health commissioner, and the call-in questions are often fascinating. And one that stuck with me was a guy saying, I know I don't need to get vaccinated. I'm thin, I'm healthy, I work out every day, I eat organically. Why would I want to put a vaccine in my body? I don't need it. My immune system will fight this off. Well, we know enough now to know that you may be more likely to have complications from COVID if you have underlying conditions. But we all know now that there are many people who were quite healthy who have died of COVID or become very, very sick. A good immune system is not prevention against this disease. A vaccination is the best prevention you can get.
How do we have the nuanced conversation that we're just having right now? Because, right, it's not as simple as overweight people are more susceptible and thin people are going to be less. Like, it's really not. How do we communicate the science of that in a more effective way?
I would say we haven't done a great job of communicating the science about COVID. And in part because people have been sort of building the plane while flying it, right? Because we didn't know anything about this disease in December 2020. 19. And everything has happened so quickly. That's on a pace we're not used to. So that created a lot of, and it was changing so quickly. So that created a lot of confusion. So obviously we need to do a better job of communicating. An example would be everyone says, well, the mRNA vaccines were so rushed. How can you trust them? That's a brand new technology. Well, that's actually not accurate.
True.
They've been working on mRNA for decades, really, and they knew quite a lot about it. And it's only because of that long-term investment in the research that they were able to shift so quickly to create this effective vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, right? So we have portrayed that as, wow, this was lightning fast, warp speed.
But it wasn't. Yeah.
Wasn't.
The certification process was hastened for good reason. We needed to get a vaccine out quickly. And now we're sitting here with full approval for at least one of the drugs and more coming. And that simply meant looking at more people over a longer period of time to ascertain side effects, not just from 2 months, but from 6 months. So it's a different certification process. But the process of preparing the vaccine was not rushed.
I was interested in the topic that you brought up where we tend to cherry pick what we believe in scientifically and what we don't believe in. Why? I think it has a lot. You made the case for it has a lot to do with our values, right? It has a lot to do, and do they align, do we perceive an alignment there? How do we communicate? How do we communicate between what is right and what is wrong based on when we're talking about people's values?
Well, I think this is part of the thing that we need to change in our culture right now that goes through not just science, but our politics and our communities, which is that we aren't talking to each other in the thoughtful way the three of us are talking right now. We tend to be talking at each other, and we tend to be staying in our communication bubbles. And so we really aren't hearing other point of views, and really critical thinking that Barbara and I would advocate we should teach and practice doesn't get enacted if you're just listening to people who agree with you and saying, that's right, that's right. We have to hear alternative points of view. It's always been difficult, but it's been made more difficult by our information and media bubbles. And that got exacerbated 10 times over when we were all locked in our houses and only seeing people online. I miss the days of being in New England when you had to decide a referendum issue, you literally went to the town hall and you literally talked to your neighbors. And they still do some of that in Vermont, where Barbara lives now. But typically, in California, we have a recall election occurring right now, and people are just filling in their mail-in ballot and sending it back. And I'm not really having a lot of communication with people about that election, and certainly no face-to-face. And I think that's something we need to do more of, is talk to people who think differently than we do. Barbara, you need to tell your story about
well, I was going to say, one of the things to realize is that values aren't monolithic. I think we get them portrayed too often in the media that way, in a very us and them manner. And I think part of what we're trying to do in the book is get people out of thinking that way, move beyond the dichotomous thinking that there are people who think like me and people who think the opposite. That's pretty ludicrous. And realize that values are also really complex. And so I gave a public talk on science denial in February 2019, right before everything happened, so pre-COVID. But I was talking about all the forms of science denial and climate change and stem cell therapy and GMOs. And, there are so many other examples. It obviously is not just COVID. And there was a man who contacted me afterwards and said, would you meet for coffee? I'm one of those people you're talking about. I don't believe in climate change, and I don't think it's human caused, and blah, blah, blah. So I said, sure, well, let's get together. And we had a very long, wonderful chat. And I think getting people together like that, where you can really listen, be warm and empathetic, and figure out what are the rudimentary values that each of us hold, and where do we have something in common. I have something in common with anybody else. I would really argue that that we ought to be able to talk to anyone else and find some place in which we do connect. And so in this case, it was me asking if he had grandchildren, because we were about the same age and we both have young grandchildren, and we began talking about how much we care about them. And I said, are you worried about the planet that we're leaving them? I mean, I think often about what it's like for my grandsons who are going to be growing up in a planet that's changing very rapidly. And he just softened and talked about how concerned he was. And then suddenly I thought, he's not really denying climate change. This is interesting. Let's go a little further. So I said, what is it that really worries you about what's being discussed on climate change? He said, it's the economics. I don't see how we're going to solve the problem. So it's easier to not think about it than to think about all the ways in which this is going to be so expensive for society. How are we going to solve this? Then we took off and had a very different conversation. So I think we would advocate that you try to talk to other people and try to find the point of common values. They're there.
Barbara, you just gave me the mic drop moment of this episode. So, I mean, that's the whole point of this show, just encapsulated in one example there. I have to know, how do you have this information, this knowledge that you know is backed by the research? How do you go into that conversation with that gentleman with not an air of self-assuredness, but one of inquisitiveness? Like, did you have to consciously think about that?
I think inquisitiveness is it exactly. I mean, be curious about how other people think. I think that's really critical. Be compassionate about why they think what they do. There's so many examples we could give along these lines. I mean, there's a yoga teacher in my town who didn't vaccinate her child until the child was 9 because her mother's group, they didn't vaccinate their kids. They had their babies at home. They breastfed. They didn't vaccinate them, blah, blah, blah. You know what that community is like. But she had this a set of values that aligned with that group. But then one day she was in conversation with someone who had an immunocompromised kid who could not vaccinate her child and said, do you realize what you're doing is selfish? Like, my kid is at risk because you don't vaccinate your kid. And that alignment between them changed her. And she went and got her kid vaccinated the very next day at 9. She realized what I really do value is my community, and I value not being selfish. I value caring about others. So finding that point of connection is so critical. But yeah, I mean, learn to listen, learn to be inquisitive, learn to be warm and accepting, and get to that point where there is commonality.
Well, that's one of the most important things that Barbara just said is listen. I mean, you hear a lot of people want to talk at other people and tell them their views. But really, it's about listening, because you're not going to find that common ground or common value that Barbara described unless you listen to someone. And we've done a lot of hunkering down in our own groups and not listening to other people. And people on the right and the left can be very dismissive of people who have alternative points of view. And then you won't get to that point that Barbara got to, where she realized they did have something in common and they did have some opportunity for connection. That takes empathy, takes openness, and it takes a willingness to listen to someone else for a few minutes that has a different point of view than you.
One of the things we advocate in the book is what philosopher Lee McIntyre calls a scientific attitude. The notion that you are appreciative of evidence, you seek it out, and you are open to changing your mind in light of evidence. And I think that's the core of our book in a lot of ways, is helping people think that way. And you might have seen it about a month ago, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, the cover story was on, should we be learning to love GMOs? And in Vermont, GMOs are anathema. And there are many reasons why. It's problematic that the seed supply is patented, and all sorts of reasons why farmers are concerned about GMOs. But the issue is, are they healthy to eat? Do we have enough knowledge yet? Do we know that they're safe? Should we be opening our minds to this? And a good friend of mine had just read the book when she read that article, and she wrote me a note and said, I read this article completely differently. I found that I was opening myself to evidence. I wasn't just shutting down. And I think that's what we would like people to do.
How destructive, or perhaps I'll say it another way, how should the science community and people who communicate about science approach the bad actors, like the study that linked vaccines to autism that was disproven, and that medical or that license was completely removed? Even so, there are studies that have been backed by corporations to influence the results. We've seen that in the sugar industry, for instance, or the software industry. How should we be communicating about these things in a way that presents the not infallible nature of science, but also what we know to be true?
I would say that it's not just the individual scientist's role, but it's our role as a scientific community, the infrastructure around research. So we, as Barbara said, we don't invest in science communication. If you look at local newspapers, the few that are left, they don't have science sections anymore. We don't fund science with government funding to the extent we used to. And so people looking for funding because of the pressures of university to be funded, they'll look for a corporate backing to do their work. And that's not necessarily optimal. You would like to have more government funding because that would be less, tilted towards whatever business or industry backs your research. So it's really the structures that are on researchers. I won't absolutely defend any dishonesty in science, but I appreciate the pressures people are under. And when you hear somebody was going up for tenure and manufactured data, a part of that is obviously completely unethical behavior, but part of it is the pressures being put on people. You shouldn't put people in a pressure cooker because they may not respond well. Of course, individuals are responsible for their own ethical behavior, but we are making it challenging for people to do their research. And we want to make it easier for people to do high quality research that informs the general well-being of the public and the planet.
And I'll go back to the self-correcting nature of science. The sugar study that you brought up was really problematic. And what they did was claim that sugar was not the problem, it was fat. And that led to the rise of the Snackwell crackers and cookies that people probably remember that were really high in sugar but low in fat. It increased obesity in the nation. There were so many things about that study that led to really poor health effects in the country. But as a result of that, when the discovery came out that they did have ties to the sugar industry, all their research was supported there. That became a big policy change in journals that you absolutely have to declare who paid for this research. You cannot publish now without listing who it is that paid for this. And that means that anybody reading that article understands there's a possible bias here. Not necessarily one, but a possible one.
Which goes back to that system 1 and system 2 thinking, like slow down on the initial reaction.
Yeah.
Think about it a little bit more. I want to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, which was, the BBC making the point that, hey, it is fact that climate change is here and is real. So we're not going to human caused, correct. And so we're not even going to give the illusion of quote unquote the other side because the other side is factually wrong. How do we get to that tipping point? Like, what is that tipping point where organizations, newspapers, communicators, scientists can make that assertion and be okay standing behind it? And you had asked me, as a journalist, what I thought about that. I was taught in journalism school, always have 3 sources. So you couldn't have an even balance, or at least some sort of odd number of sources. And that Wikipedia was not a primary source. But yeah, it is interesting. There was a heavy dose of present a balanced, well-rounded argument, but it's not the vast majority of issues actually do not have a yes or yes, no, fair, unfair, right, wrong kind of dichotomy of choice.
Well, I think people have to, as reporters, tell the real story. They have to tell how many studies are going into this, what's the number of participants. We probably shouldn't be doing these blast outs on Twitter with these clickbait headlines of a new study shows this. That's probably very misleading, because 2 weeks later, a new study shows the opposite. That's lending to the distrust, because people think, oh, well, they just changed their mind again. But that wasn't a consensus point of view. You can't wait for the full consensus. I wouldn't want reporters to wait 40 years to report on climate change. Obviously, you can't wait, but you can present some of the details of how scientists know what they know about a particular topic. If you're going to report on a new study because it really is so interesting and groundbreaking, then make it clear that it's a single study, that it had this many participants, that scientists haven't confirmed it yet. So it's really about providing more of the nuance and less of the clickbait.
The problem is it's not just last week that we had enough studies on climate change. We've had them for decades. And we had corporations manufacturing doubt, leading us to think that maybe we didn't have enough. So Exxon hired exactly the same PR firm that R.J. Reynolds had to cast doubt on whether tobacco caused cancer or not. And they did a very good job of getting the public to think, we don't really know for sure yet, so maybe we shouldn't be worried. We did know for sure. We've known for quite some time.
Yeah. I think I hardly ever watch the local news anymore because I just can't take I can't take all the bad news. But it does strike me that often brand new single source studies are presented as like, this new thing will help you lose 15 pounds in 15 minutes, something like that. How do we begin to cultivate this mindset of, as Lee McIntyre explained, that scientific attitude? How do we as individuals begin to cultivate that, so when we see something like that, we don't take it as, well, the news reported it, so it must be true? Where do we begin as individuals to begin to hone our scientific skills?
I think we need to do a better job teaching about the nature of science. What science is, how scientists know what they know, what scientists don't know, and why they don't know it. And I think we have to do a better job reporting. If we're going to report these one-off studies, they have to be more contextualized. The news is called the news because it's new, but not everything new is necessarily worth putting that much emphasis on. There's thousands and thousands of new studies appearing every day. Having more science-educated journalists and there's some excellent ones that we should be aware of, who can understand whether a new study is really news or just a new study, that we really should wait for more confirmation. So it's better education of ourselves and the general public, and an expectation that science writers should be supported and should have the expertise to weigh in on these headlines and whether they're really worth sharing, or we should hold off until there's more evidence.
But unfortunately, so much of this is exacerbated by the way social media and the internet work, how many clicks something gets. So my favorite in the last month was Harvard Magazine reported a new study done at Harvard that if you eat chocolate early in the day, you will lose weight. I mean, this is mind-boggling. And so before you start spreading chocolate on your toast, you might want to look at the study that only had 19 participants. That, of course, if you read the study, it talks about how much more evidence is needed. And yet, because it's just so clever, I'm sure that has been circulated widely. And it had a clickbait headline, of course.
Yeah, I as a personal trainer have not been asked that question yet, but I know it's coming. Gale, Barbara, as I do of all of my guests, I would love to ask both of you, what's a question that you wish you were asked more? Barbara, I'll start with you.
Oh, I should ask more. Let me think a minute. Gale, do you
I'll go immediately? I'll go then. Yeah. I think that we should ask, what can we do? I think we're too often asking, what are we going to do about the science denier? What are we going to do about the purveyor of misinformation? I think what we want to convey in the book, that there's things you can do as an individual. There's things you can do to not be as influenced by the misinformation, be more thoughtful and reflective in your conversations with others. So I think individuals need to think about not just what can we do about bad actors, or what can we do about purveyors of misinformation and science deniers, but what can we do to be more critical consumers of information ourselves? That's a good question.
I would say, what can we do politically? Okay. And I would encourage everyone to find out if the people who are running for office have scientific thinking, if they trust science. I'll go back to your first question. Are they likely to seek evidentiary-based proposals? Are they eager to hear from scientists? Are they going to build a panel of scientists to try to get accurate information to the public? Are they going to base their policies on what we know from evidence and from substantiated science?
Gale, I had a follow-up question for your response there. Does it start with a level of self-awareness, like that we tend to just be irrational and go for the first thing that we see? Like, does there have to be some level of self-awareness here?
I think so. One of the things we try to portray in the book is, as Barbara started out with, is there isn't two groups of people, a set of science deniers and a set of science acceptors. We can all fall prey to misunderstanding, misconceiving, or denying science if we're not thoughtful and reflective, as we've said. So I think that we can all stop categorizing other people and saying the problem is with other people. I think we should be reflective of our own thinking. We can all become better consumers of science, and then we can support others. Once we've done that, Barbara shared the story about her friend who more critically read a GMO story. What's great about that is she's now going to have a different point of view when she talks to her peers next time. And now she will help that person think differently, maybe share the article. Maybe that person will read the article differently. So as you change how you consume information, you can bring that change to others. And I think that's something that we need to be more thoughtful of, rather than just pointing at and making fun of people who are having science doubts or confusions.
Barbara, where do you point at and say, I take hope in what I'm seeing there? Are there sources or journals or people, science writers that you look to who are doing it well and we can look to as a model of how we should be behaving and thinking about this? I think, some of what's come out in the New York Times recently about the scientific uncertainty and people learning to do that has been very impressive. Naomi Oreskes, who wrote a book called Why Trust Science. I think there are a number of people who are writing persuasively. Lee McIntyre, who has a book that just came out 2 weeks ago on how to talk to a science denier. There are a number of people writing persuasively about all these issues. And I think and I think all of you who are doing podcasts on this topic are doing a tremendous service, because increasingly that's where people get new ideas. And they love hearing this kind of thing discussed openly. And I really appreciate that you've taken an interest in it. Of course. And I would be remiss to say your book is not one of them. We should include that in there. How can people get the book, and where can they turn to get their copy?
They can get it from Oxford University Press online. They can even get it from Amazon, and they can get it either in hard copy or digital Kindle copy. It's easy to find. And it just went into a third printing, so we had a little bit of a lag with copies, but we found out yesterday that more are now available. Well, fantastic. By the time this gets out, then hopefully people will be able to get their copy. No worries at all. So anything I should have asked about? Anything that you came on wanting to make sure we talked about that I didn't get to? The only thing we didn't spend a lot of time on here is emotions, which is a big part of our book.
Gosh.
We talked about motivation and identity and all the cognitive biases and searching online. We didn't talk a lot about emotions, and a lot of these topics are pretty fraught with emotions. And so it's important to keep in mind that you think and reason with your emotions. So you can't get rid of them. You don't want to get rid of them, but you want to make sure they're working in service of your thinking and not shutting down your thinking.
No doubt, what we've talked about probably brought up emotions in people. So, Barbara, I'm interested, that gentleman that you had that conversation with, what was his emotion like from the beginning of your interactions to the point where you were having that conversation?
He's highly logical about things, more than emotional, I would say.
Yeah.
But certainly softer by the end and calmer, and not trying to be persuasive about his point of view, but we were having a genuine interchange by the end.
I love that. I keep coming back to that because it's so interesting to me. I just love that story. Thank you for sharing it. Anything from you, Barbara, that I may have missed or you wanted to touch on?
No, but I would just say I would encourage people to talk to people who don't think exactly the same. In Vermont, there's even an organization that gets people together who have different ideas and who want to talk to somebody who thinks differently than they do. And we probably need more of that kind of thing going on.
What's that organization called? It seems like I should be in connection with them.
There are two different things. One is called the Lincoln Brigade, and it's a group of people who wanted to get together with people who thought differently. I don't know very much about that group at all. And then the public radio station is now organizing, matching people up with people who have slightly different beliefs, or you get to decide what your comfort zone is before they match you so that you can have conversations. But the public radio station's doing it.
Wonderful. That's great work.
Yeah.
Barbara, Gale, thank you so much for this. Thank you for writing a wonderfully written and researched book. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
So many thanks to Gale and Barbara for sharing their story and their wisdom here on the show this week. Please do me and Gale and Barbara a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation, and help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. If you like the conversations with the amazing guests that I have on the show each week, like Gale and Barbara, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Subscribing also helps the show gain more reach, and that always is appreciated. Follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Michael D. Ashford. And if you ever want to get in touch with me, you can message me there, or you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.